the focus of the company right now is to make our test available, since it's been validated by peer-reviewed journals, some of the highest impact factor journals in the marketplace, in the Alzheimer's journals. So we've been published many, many times in the Alzheimer's and key neurology journals. So, there's validation from Dr. Alcon's peers of the science and the clinical trial work that we've done.
Welcome to Business Ninjas, brought to you by WriteForMe, where you'll hear from business leaders who are out there growing their business and slaying it every day. Learn from the masters. Let's get started.
Hey everybody, welcome back for another episode of Business Ninjas. I'm here today with Frank Amato. He's the president and CEO at SYNAPSE Dx. Frank, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you, Kelsey. I'm glad to be here today and looking forward to our discussion.
Yeah, excited to have you. So Frank, why don't you start and tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So I've been a healthcare focused individual now for probably, the better part of 30 years. I started out working really in a kind of a high science focused high school program in Westchester County in chemistry. And then that led to being a medic with the 82nd Airborne Division, an infantry-based medic. And then coming out of the military and getting a college degree, I joined the pharmaceutical industry, and I worked, in sales for a number of years, in marketing and operations, and ultimately found myself in a leadership position at Merck, running their specialty commercial operations group. So I had probably 10 businesses, all largely focused on specialists. So if an oncologist was using one of our drugs, then my team would be responsible for the oncologists. Dermatologists, if they were using one of our medicines, then the team would focus on them and so forth. So I had 10 different groups, and we had probably $4.5 billion in revenue responsibility, 2,500 people. So it was a really neat opportunity to kind of work, across different therapeutic areas and have the opportunity to meet with different specialists and really learn a lot about the different approaches that are being taken for different disease states. And that then led me to working for one of Merck's investment companies, a company called electroCore. We were moving the stimulation of the vagus nerve, which is in your neck, from inside the body, which is where it lived for 25 years, to outside the body, where you could take a cell phone and essentially stimulate the nerve for a variety of FDA-cleared headache conditions. So that was equally very interesting. We were kind of bending the curve on how to treat a headache and not having to ingest, inhale, or in some way inject a drug into your body. We took that company public, and it's still moving along there and helping to treat a variety of different neuroscience-like conditions in the field beyond just headache now. I left my role there and took a little time off for the first time in 30 years. And when I decided to come back into the industry, my focus was really in the one area where we've made no headway in the 30 years that I've been doing this, and that's neurodegeneration, and most specifically Alzheimer's disease. And I met the folks at SYNAPSE Dx, namely the founding scientist, Dr. Daniel Alcon, who was a program chief at NIH, NINDS in the neurology group for probably a couple of decades. And then Jay Rockefeller, the U.S. Senator in West Virginia, asked Dan to take his preclinical work at the NIH and bring it into the clinic, start using it in human beings at the newly funded and designed Neuroscience Institute he named after his mother, who coincidentally died from Alzheimer's disease, Chet Rockefeller. And Dan then ran 3 different clinical trials, and he developed the 3 biomarkers that we are now commercializing at SYNAPSE Dx currently. So that's a little bit about myself and how I, through a circuitous career, really ended up here in the diagnostics role. So worked in pharma, worked in biotech, a little time in med device, and now I'm on the diagnostic side.
Well, it sounds like you've had, an interesting journey getting you to SYNAPSE, and, also, I appreciate your service. Two of my brothers are Marines, so I love meeting people who have served. So I appreciate your service. So I appreciate the background. A little bit about what SYNAPS does. Talking a little bit more about SYNAPSE Dx.
Sure. So one of the things that Dr. Alcon decided when he moved to the Rockefeller Neuroscience Institute was, the NIH had just previously identified the gold standard definition for diagnosing Alzheimer's disease, which was dementia in life. So actually getting a dementia diagnosis using a psychometric test. So there are different tests that are used to evaluate one's cognitive abilities. Those are mini mental exams or MOCA exams out there. And the patient answers a series of questions and so forth, and then they get scored. And depending upon what their score is, it'll indicate whether they have dementia or not. So Dr. Alcon really wanted to follow that definition where you have dementia in life and then amyloid plaque and neurofibrillary tau tangles at autopsy. That's really the only way up until recently to diagnose the condition, to objectively diagnose it. Mm-hmm. And obviously, with the a diagnosis of exclusion, really, meaning that, once a physician finds out whether you have dementia, and Alzheimer's disease will be the cause of that about 2/3 of the time, to tell a patient that, if nothing else shows up in the next 5 years, no other symptoms that would indicate that your dementia is being caused by something else, well, then it's likely Alzheimer's disease. It's not a great way to really diagnose a devastating disease like this. So Dr. Alcon decided that, he was going to follow that definition. So he went around and worked with probably 4 or 5 different medical centers and began to collect skin samples right off the inner upper forearm of people, small skin punch biopsy. It's a 3 millimeter. It's almost like taking blood, like a venipuncture. And then he collected those skin samples from patients who were diagnosed with dementia. And then he followed those patients out until they were able to give or have an autopsy. And that autopsy then confirmed whether the dementia was being caused by Alzheimer's or whether it was being caused by something else. And the something else could be one of 20 different conditions. It could be as simple as Lyme's disease or vitamin B deficiency. It could be a stroke, trauma that the patient experienced in a car accident or playing football when they were younger or some contact sport. There could be vascular disease in the body that could cause it, and a variety of different conditions. Mm-hmm. So we were able to unblind those samples and measure the biomarkers. We have 3 biomarkers that Dr. Alcon developed, measure those biomarkers versus the autopsy. So we are the only autopsy validated diagnostic for Alzheimer's disease that's in the market today. Wow. Along with that autopsy validation, Dr. Alcon also hypothesized that it's really the loss of synapses in the brain. The synapses are where your memories lie. It's that loss of synapses that ends up causing the disease. It's not what the field has thought for 25 years, which is that amyloid plaque. They're kind of like little tombstones in the brain that form. They're very dense proteins. And these tau tangles that occur also in the brain correlate very closely with Alzheimer's disease, but are not causative. So trying to find them and trying to treat them has never demonstrated a cognitive improvement for the patient. What we've been able to do is remove protein out of the brain. Good for us. That's awesome. But unless it really has an impact on cognitive impairment, it's not really a cure, nor is it a great way to diagnose the condition. So that's kind of what we did here early days with this company. We then raised some professional financing. So we went out and did a Series A financing with a syndicate of investors, raised $10 million several years ago. And we started down the path of commercialization. We went to Medicare, and we have 2 codes that were assigned to us from Medicare for our test called the DISCERN test. And those 2 codes allow us to go out and sell the product and get reimbursed. CMS, Medicare, also published a price that they're willing to pay us for when we run the test. And now we're starting in Texas, and we are selling the test into community-based neurology practices and geriatricians and also primary care. And we're processing samples. I think at this point, we've processed more than 500 samples that have come in from the field, and we've reported back the results to help clinicians diagnose this condition as early as possible. That's really the goal. So then they can work with the patient and the patient's family to design a care plan that can really help them, think through the things that they may want to do in order to bend the curve on their cognitive impairment.
And I think you made a few really great points, the importance of early diagnoses and, being able to support the family, support the patient. I want to circle back to something that you mentioned about early diagnoses and talking about the testing, because the standard practice of care involves cognitive testing and then diagnostic testing, correct? But SYNAPS uses a different type of testing. Walk me through that a little bit.
Sure. So typically a patient would come into a clinician's office, physician's office, either themselves or a family member, complain about some memory issues, whatever they might be. And then the physician may or may not decide to do a psychometric test on that patient. The tests I mentioned earlier, I think some of us might be familiar with, put the clock hands at, 10:40, and people struggle with that. Who is the president back 4 years ago, and so on and so forth. So once that happens and the physician suspects that the patient might have dementia, they then put them through a battery of tests. They take blood, right? And they're probably looking for a number of different issues in the blood that could lead them to information that would allow them to continue to kind of seek out what could be causing that cognitive impairment. They're probably going to get them an MRI and maybe even a CAT scan. And in those cases, they're probably looking to rule out things like a tumor in the brain, or maybe a brain bleed of some kind, could be a stroke, or maybe the individual had, a fall or a car accident or something that might have caused that. In some cases, they'll put them through a lumbar puncture. So they'll do a spinal tap to look at their cerebral spinal fluid, and looking for things like plaque and tau again. And then lastly, in some cases, maybe not in the community, but more in the academic setting, so a large academic medical center, they might look to do a PET scan. They have the patient ingest radio-labeled dye, and that dye then is a tracer for finding those 2 components, plaque and tau, in the brain. And then they gather all that information over probably, 3 or 4 month time period, and they still have to make a subjective diagnosis of what the patient has. And we've seen in the literature that in the first 4 to 5 years of dementia, the clinician, the physician, the doctor's accuracy of diagnosing the disease correctly is about the flip of a coin. It's about 50-50. So that's what was really concerning to Dr. Alcon and others here, and hence why we've developed a test that we've validated through autopsies. We've collected 150 skin samples and used them in the 3 published clinical trials that we published years ago. And those biomarkers, as I indicated earlier, track very closely with the loss of synapses, which we believe is really the causation of the disease. What's causing that loss of synapses? We don't know, but that loss is what one should really be focused on from the standpoint of determining whether they have Alzheimer's or not. Many people can have, plaque and tau in their brain. Even there have been studies in the New England Journal of Medicine in 2021 where they looked at 330 centenarians in Europe who had brains riddled with plaque and tau. and not one of them had any cognitive deficit. So you're 100 years old, you've got plaque and tau in your brain, and you're as sharp as, a 50, 60-year-old. And that's, really concerning. If physicians are going to be looking for, remnants of the disease that don't cause it, well, then we ought to be focused in areas where we know run very closely with that cognitive impairment and a decline that continues over time. You can get diagnosed with dementia and not have that precipitous decline in your cognition, and it's likely another cause of dementia. It's not, or another. It's not Alzheimer's disease. It's some other, condition you might have. So I hope that sheds a little bit of light. I might be a little long-winded on this, but that's kind of how we've differentiated ourselves and where our focus is in the marketplace.
No, I appreciate, the background and, your explanation. I think it's really helpful, for our listeners who may not have the expertise in the field, or, have fortunately, or, for them not had to, deal with Alzheimer's. So I appreciate that explanation. And, you mentioned a little bit about research and development, and I know that plays a really key role in advancing, medical technologies and the growth that Synapses has. So what are can you talk about some key milestones or breakthroughs that have led to Synapse being at the place it is now?
Sure. So I would say that the focus of the company right now is to make our test available, since it's been validated by peer-reviewed journals, some of the highest impact factor journals in the marketplace, in the Alzheimer's journals. So we've been published many, many times in the Alzheimer's and key neurology journals. So, there's validation from Dr. Alcon's peers of the science and the clinical trial work that we've done. The second thing is we went to the, governing body for 99% of the diagnostics that are in the market today. And that's called the CLIA, and we got certified through CLIA. Since, we're not adding anything into the body, the FDA doesn't really regulate diagnostics, especially when you're using, bodily fluids like, saliva or blood or urine, or in our case, skin. It's really about evaluating the skin. And as long as your test has been, peer reviewed and published, then that's the first step in the process. We then went to the American Medical Association and shared our data with the association. They then indicated that we should meet with CMS and that they would support getting our own, code for our test. You can either be crosswalked to another test that's in the market, or you could get your own gap fill type code, which is what we were given. And then from there, we put together a dossier for Medicare to consider how much they think the test should be reimbursed. And we factor in all the things that we do in our lab. We do a lot of cell culturing work, and then we apply our different assays to the test. The skin has to be shipped back to the lab, and so on and so forth. So once we landed on a price where we could build a business around that, and Medicare understood what our cost structure is for doing the work we do, then we were able to get those codes and pricing, and now that allows us to submit claims into Medicare to get reimbursed. So those were kind of the early day milestones. We also ran a beta launch, kind of a pre-launch program down in Texas with about 15 practices, where we collected 350 skin samples. We wanted to learn, what needed to be in our kit that we would send to a doctor's office so they could take a skin sample. Once it's sent back to our lab, what testing have we done, and, what research have we done to ensure that when that skin sample comes back, it's viable and we can use it for testing and grow it and so forth. We also wanted to learn, when we gave the results back to the clinician, was it clear to them? Was it confusing in any way? So we learned a lot over about an 8-month period collecting those samples. And then, we also learned that we needed to move to a more commercially conducive type laboratory as well. We were in the Johns Hopkins laboratory campus in Rockville, Maryland. And it's really a research lab. We needed to have, a lab that allowed us to bring some of the the different gases that we use, like liquid nitrogen, into the lab more readily, where the FedEx folks could come and drop samples off and pick them up pretty readily. So you didn't want to be on the top floor of the building in case the door was locked at the bottom, things like that, just really practical things like that we learned a lot in doing that project. Now we're focused on strategic partnerships in addition to commercializing or selling our tests. So we're working with a top 5 pharmaceutical company that's confidential at this point in time, and one of the largest retirement communities in the United States. And the goal there is to really use our test amongst other biomarkers to help identify patients at the earliest stages of disease, because the industry writ large believes that if the earlier we catch this disease, the more likely our drugs are going to be effective in helping patients. So, what of all the biomarkers that are out in the marketplace today, most of which I've discussed already, plaque tau and ours and others, which ones are going to be most effective at trying to find those patients? And we consider this a longitudinal-like study. It's probably going to take about 3 years to complete. There'll be about 400 patients initially in there, and then we plan to follow these patients out more long-term. And then lastly, despite the fact that we don't need FDA clearance in order to sell this test, we think it's important that we go through the FDA with our data, with our information. Will we get cleared and get an FDA clearance for our test? I'm not sure at this point in time. I've been in this industry long enough to know you never handicap the FDA. But we're bringing forward all of our information in a way to demonstrate that, that we can get over every obstacle and every hurdle to try to help as many patients as possible, and maybe be part of, many of the clinical trials that are being run in Alzheimer's disease today. I think there's 175 going on as we speak worldwide. It's a terrible condition. There are nearly 7 million people affected with it in the United States. About 700,000 new cases of dementia are diagnosed each year. The Alzheimer's Association said that might pale in comparison to the number of people who actually have dementia. We could be off by 30 to 50% in our diagnoses of the condition. And the baby boomer population is going to turn this condition 20 years from now into twice to 2 to 3 times as many people who might have the condition. So all that said, we're dedicated and focused on trying to, be part of the solution for what we need long-term, both here in the United States and globally.
Frank, I really appreciate those insights. I think it's, the work that you're doing is so important, being able to provide, these tests. I really appreciate your insights and, and all the different information you've shared. So, as we start to wrap up, is there anything that you want to leave our listeners with, about the industry, about Alzheimer's, about SYNAPS, anything you want to leave our listeners with?
Sure. I think that, this is a very confusing field right now. Every day in the internet, news media, hard copy, television news shows, etc., you hear about all these different potential concoctions that could help diagnose the disease, using the retina, or using, artificial intelligence to, take a picture of someone's face, or listening to their voice and how that might change over time. Could be a digital biomarker, and all these different things that are hardly validated for actually diagnosing the condition. And you validate it by using that gold standard definition we talked about earlier, using autopsies. So for the listener, I would be really clear on whether the actual biomarkers that are being bandied about in the media actually have validation. Are they published, peer-reviewed, all that kind of good stuff? So that's the first thing. The second thing is, I would think really hard about what type of interventions are being utilized for your loved one or yourself, meaning that, there have been drugs that have been approved but have not improved the cognitive deficit. That's the disease. It's you're losing your memory, that could happen very quickly over the next few years. And you should be really clear on what it is that's being recommended for you or your loved one, and whether the chance of that having any success on improving cognition is something that is available or not. So I think those are really important things. And the other thing, there have been some very large studies that have been conducted by major academic centers, Wake Forest being one of them. There's the finger and the pointer study. I think they looked at 10,000 people or more, and they changed their lifestyle by adding mental exercises every day, physical exercise every day, and changing their diet. Now, they didn't stop the loss of memory or the cognitive decline, but they were able to slow it down considerably. So there are, current interventions people can embark upon that may have positive impact on their diagnosis ultimately, and the way that they, might slow down their cognitive loss. So I think it's worthwhile for folks to try to get some clarity in a disease state and in an area of medicine where there seems to be just a lot of confusion out there for doctors, for patients, for their families, for the people who pay for it, the insurance companies, and even in some cases, some of the societies out there that review a lot of this data and decide whether they want to peer review it and recommend it for publication. So that's the unfortunate part, but there are interventions available today that could be very helpful for you and your loved one. And if we, SYNAPSE Dx, can help in any way, we'd love to be a part of the solution.
I think that's great. Well, Frank, this has been a very insightful conversation. I appreciate, all of your insights, where, what SYNAPSE is doing, the hard work that you're doing to, change the landscape. So, I think this was a really great conversation, and I appreciate you being on Business Ninjas today.
My pleasure, Kelsey. It's a real honor to be able to do this, and look forward to chatting again in the future.
Absolutely.